In early modern philosophy, Berkeley made a strong case for his idealism or anti-realism. All that a seasoned empiricist can go on are our immediate sensory experiences. And there is no reason whatsoever to assume or stipulate, as Locke did, that some of those experiences correspond with the external world and some do not. On the contrary, esse est percipi, secondary qualities can be generalized. Just as tastes and colors, the so-called primary qualities of shapes, sizes, textures and so on, also only exist as ideas in the minds of perceivers. In a similar vein, Philippe Petit has suggested that response dependence can be generalized, though in this context Petit is talking about concepts rather than properties. However, in this last clip, I want to suggest that we can indeed generalize response dependency as the only possible middle way between realism and anti-realism. Earlier in this MOOC, we have been considering a number of realisms. For instance, realism about universals and realism about values. These are all examples of local realism, realism about whether an entity or kinds of entities exist. And the opposing views are examples of local anti-realism. However, in this last clip, it's time to ramp things up a gear. Now we are going to consider the debate between global realism and global anti-realism. The issue is whether there is a mind-independent world in the first place, or even whether it makes sense to suppose that there might be a mind-independent world. In a nutshell, the global realist reasons that we have only limited access to reality. The external world and what exists in it depends in no way on our experiences, conceptions or knowledge. By contrast, the anti-realist reasons, pretty much like Berkeley, that our conceptions and knowledge aim to organize and explain our sensory experiences, but another kind of being with another cognitive apparatus would most probably organize and explain its experiences quite differently. So we may not assume, and being clinged to our idiosyncratic cognitive apparatus, we cannot even start to make sense of the very idea that there exists a mind-independent world. Both realism and anti-realism build on quite powerful intuitions. How can we ever settle the issue? Suggesting that global response dependence is the only possible middle way between global realism and global anti-realism boils down to denying that we will ever be able to settle the issue. We can speculate about the mind-independent world, its possible ingredients, its possible structure. We may even use criteria like parsimony to evaluate different speculations, but we can never know for sure what is and what isn't out there. Taking global response dependence seriously means adopting in turn all kinds of local response dependence. We may apply what also applies to tastes, colors and values to universals, causation and the like as well. We'll never find out whether they are exclusively out there or exclusively in here, but no worries. A dispositional analysis of universals, causation and so on allows us to further our speculative understanding on either side of the equation. On the objective side, we may strengthen our grip on the ground of the disposition. And on the subjective side, we may learn about the responses in our sensory and cognitive apparatus. We might have the impression that it's easier for an anti-realist to adopt response dependence than for a realist. However, we shouldn't underestimate that the move requires the anti-realists to shift gears in their epistemology, or their take on metaphysical knowledge. They should adopt, more specifically, fallibilism instead of foundationalism about justification. In that sense, global response dependence is arguably reminiscent of a good old-fashioned skeptical tradition, Pyrrhonism. Pyrrhonism adopts the correspondence theory of truth, but then finds equally forceful arguments for and against each metaphysical proposition. Since there is no non-question begging or rational procedure to tell true metaphysical statements from false ones, or in a more recent terminology, since justification is impossible, people's metaphysical beliefs can only happen to be true by sheer epistemic luck. But that doesn't prevent the true skepticals from continuing to look for the truth, even when realizing that they will never get there. Elsewhere, I've argued that fallibilism is the contemporary version of Pyrrhonism. I would like to suggest now to go back to one of the first questions that we've addressed in this MOOC. Is metaphysics possible? I suggested then that the modest metaphysics, in line with Pyrrhonism and fallibilism, is indeed possible. By now, we can make our proposal more specific. Response dependence is the ideal square one of metaphysics. We have our experiences, we experience the world as if it is full of properties. But which properties, and possibly also other entities, are really out there in the external mind-independent world, and which are rather in here, in our minds? In what sense and to what extent are they out there, and in what sense and to what extent are they in here? These are all open questions. We can speculate about the possible answers. As positive skepticals, it's even our task to keep on speculating about the possible answers, but we'll never know them. In terms of knowledge, if true belief suffices for knowledge, first-order metaphysical knowledge is possible. It's also desirable. That's why we must carry on speculating. But second-order metaphysical knowledge, which by definition is reflective and requires justification, is forever beyond our reach.